If you have ever cared deeply for someone who kept pulling away from you, even though some part of them clearly cared, you may have witnessed a very painful contradiction. They were not always running because they felt nothing. Sometimes they were running because being emotionally exposed frightened them. People who appear completely independent, emotionally detached, or incredibly strong can sometimes be carrying the deepest fear of being vulnerable. Love asks them to lower the defenses they spent years building. It asks them to trust, receive, depend, and allow another person close enough to see what they normally hide. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that kind of closeness can feel threatening. They may want connection while simultaneously fearing everything that connection requires. That is where the painful cycle begins, because the closer love gets, the more desperately they may try to escape it. One of the most fascinating parts of avoidant attachment is the powerful need for emotional control that appears whenever someone feels unsafe inside a relationship. Many avoidant people develop an internal belief that relying on another person is dangerous. They convince themselves that independence is strength and that needing someone automatically creates weakness. Instead of expressing what they feel, they create distance. Instead of asking for reassurance, they retreat. Instead of admitting that someone matters, they convince themselves that they would be perfectly fine without them. These behaviors can create the temporary sensation that they are in charge of their emotions and their relationships. Distance feels manageable because nothing unexpected can reach them there, but eventually something happens that their defenses cannot completely prevent. When someone who genuinely loved them is no longer there, the sense of control they depended on begins to disappear. The collapse usually does not arrive as some dramatic emotional explosion. In the beginning, it can be almost invisible. They may simply start replaying certain memories, remembering conversations, or wondering why the other person is no longer reaching out. Then come the explanations they use to make everything feel reasonable. They might tell themselves that they only needed breathing room, that the relationship was never right, or that the other person expected too much. These explanations can protect them from confronting the more uncomfortable truth underneath. They become a psychological shield against guilt, grief, regret, and vulnerability. Yet eventually, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. Genuine affection leaves an emotional space behind when it disappears. No amount of distraction can completely reproduce the comfort, familiarity, and emotional safety that once existed. What once felt like peaceful distance can slowly begin to feel like an empty room filled with echoes. For an avoidant mind, having control can become deeply comforting because predictability feels safer than emotional uncertainty. Many people with avoidant patterns learned early in life that emotional expression was not always welcomed. Their feelings may have been ignored, minimized, criticized, or met with emotional distance. Over time, they learned to survive by depending on themselves and keeping difficult emotions contained. As adults, they may naturally gravitate toward independence, rational thinking, personal space, and situations where they do not have to feel too exposed. But there is a painful contradiction hidden inside this strategy. What feels like control is often simply a sophisticated form of emotional avoidance. They are not necessarily mastering their emotions, they are escaping them. And eventually, whatever we repeatedly refuse to face has a way of demanding our attention. Avoidance may provide temporary relief, but it rarely removes the emotional cost. Eventually, there can be a moment when the avoidant person is forced to confront what their behavior has actually created. I think of this as the emotional mirror moment. Suddenly, they begin noticing that the person who once checked on them has stopped checking. The messages become fewer or disappear completely. The warmth they once received is no longer surrounding them. The emotional availability they assumed would always be there has changed, and this does not necessarily happen because the other person became bitter or wanted revenge. Sometimes it happens because they finally realized that constantly reaching towards someone who keeps pulling away is destroying their own peace. They stop chasing, they stop proving themselves, they stop trying to force closeness. And that is when the avoidant can experience something they never expected. The distance they created has become real. The silence they once controlled now exists beyond their control. Psychologically, this can feel like the collapse of an old internal story. For a long time, the avoidant may have believed that withdrawing gave them the upper hand. They could decide when to become close, when to disappear, and when to return. They could tell themselves that they were simply protecting their independence. But eventually, reality challenges that belief. Love cannot be managed like a switch that someone can turn on and off whenever they feel comfortable. A person can create distance, but they cannot guarantee that the other person will remain emotionally available forever. That realization can be incredibly painful. All the reasoning, pride, explanations, and carefully constructed defenses begin losing their power. Because meaningful connection does not disappear simply because someone refuses to acknowledge it. You can suppress feelings, you can stay busy, you can act unaffected, but emotional experiences can remain deeply registered within you, resurfacing when the distractions become quiet. And perhaps the most painful irony is that the person they pushed away may have been one of the safest opportunities they ever had to experience genuine emotional connection. The very relationship that activated their fear may also have offered them the possibility of confronting that fear in a healthy environment. Instead, their defenses convinced them that escape was safer than intimacy. They chose distance because closeness felt overwhelming, only to discover later that the absence hurts in a completely different way. When their protective story finally falls apart, they may find themselves facing the consequences of choices they once believed were protecting them. There is no longer another person to blame, no convenient explanation to hide behind, and no emotional distance strong enough to silence what they feel. Eventually, they have to sit with the reality of what they lost. And sometimes, that is the first moment when they truly understand the value of the love they once pushed away. If you have been the person left waiting, questioning everything, and wondering whether someone who walked away will ever understand the value of what they had, there is something important to remember. They may eventually understand it, but usually not while you are still standing in front of them trying to prove your love. As long as you remain constantly available, they can avoid confronting the consequences of their own distance. Your presence softens the reality of what they have created. But when you stop reaching, stop explaining, and stop trying to convince them that the connection mattered, something changes. They are finally left alone with the space their choices created. There is no longer anyone to push away or pull closer whenever they feel uncomfortable. That is when reflection can begin. And while you may have already grown through choosing yourself and healing, they may only then begin learning what genuine emotional connection actually requires. For a long time, their pattern of disappearing, creating distance, making excuses, and building emotional barriers may have looked like an attempt to avoid other people. But underneath it, something much deeper was happening. They were often trying to escape the parts of themselves that felt vulnerable, needy, frightened, or emotionally exposed. It was easier to blame the relationship than to examine the fear within themselves. It was easier to say they needed freedom than to admit intimacy made them uncomfortable. Yet love does not simply disappear because someone was too afraid to receive it properly. What happened between you can continue to exist through the lessons it left behind and the awareness it created. And if they ever return, it may not always be because they are ready to rebuild the relationship. Sometimes people come back because they finally want to understand something they were emotionally incapable of understanding before. There may be a quiet realization inside them that they never expected to reach. They may eventually recognize that what they were protecting themselves from was not really another person. They were protecting themselves from emotional dependence, uncertainty, vulnerability, and the possibility of being deeply known. They thought creating distance would preserve their freedom, but eventually they may understand that the distance also prevented them from experiencing the connection they secretly wanted. They did not actually lose control because someone else took it away from them. They lost something far more meaningful. They lost access to a genuine emotional bond because they kept treating closeness as a threat. That realization can be difficult because it forces them to separate the story they told themselves from what actually happened. And once they see that difference clearly, it becomes much harder to pretend that walking away solved the problem. Maybe that awareness becomes the beginning of something healthier for them. Real emotional freedom does not come from becoming so independent that nobody can ever hurt you. It does not come from silence, emotional detachment, or refusing to need anyone. Those things may create protection, but protection is not the same as freedom. True freedom begins when a person can finally tell themselves the truth without running from it. It means understanding that vulnerability, is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that you are willing to be real. It takes courage to let someone matter. It takes courage to communicate instead of disappearing. It takes courage to stay present when your instincts are telling you to escape. Eventually, an avoidant person may begin to understand that love cannot be controlled without also being limited. You cannot experience deep intimacy while constantly keeping one foot outside the relationship. Your silence can become one of the clearest messages you ever send, especially when that silence is no longer an attempt to get their attention. When you stop waiting for them to change, stop monitoring their behavior, and stop keeping yourself emotionally positioned for their return, your silence becomes a boundary. It says that your life is no longer organized around someone else's uncertainty. That can be a powerful turning point because they can no longer depend on the assumption that you will always be there whenever they decide to come closer. The dynamic changes completely. They are forced to experience the consequences of distance without having someone constantly repairing the connection for them. And that is often when the illusion of control begins to weaken. They may finally recognize that controlling closeness was never the same as creating security. In trying so hard to protect themselves from emotional pain, they may have created the exact loss they were afraid of experiencing. When that realization finally arrives, it can change the way they understand the entire relationship. They may look back and recognize moments they dismissed, conversations they avoided, affection they took for granted, and opportunities for closeness they repeatedly rejected. They may understand that the person who loved them was not asking them to surrender their identity or independence. They were simply asking for emotional presence, honesty, and mutual connection. That difference can be profound, because once someone truly understands what their defenses cost them, they cannot easily return to the same level of unconsciousness. The awareness becomes part of them. Whether they come back or never speak again, something may have shifted internally. And for you, that is why you do not need to chase an explanation or force someone to acknowledge your worth. You do not have to wait for their realization to validate what you experienced. You may spend a long time wondering whether their eventual regret will give you the closure you need. But real closure does not require watching someone suffer, return, apologize, or finally admit that they made a mistake. Your closure can begin much earlier, the moment you stop making their realization the condition for your healing. You already learned something important when you chose to step away from a cycle that kept hurting you. You learned that love cannot be sustained by one person constantly reaching while the other repeatedly retreats. Their breaking point does not have to become your unfinished business. If they eventually face themselves, that is their journey. If they finally understand what they lost, that understanding belongs to them. Your responsibility is different. You get to keep moving forward, knowing that you loved sincerely, learned deeply, and chose yourself when the relationship could no longer meet you there. Sometimes the greatest closure is simply no longer needing them to provide it, and perhaps this is the part you need to hear most clearly. If you loved an avoidant person deeply, you may have spent so much time trying to understand their behavior that you slowly forgot to understand your own. You analyzed the silence, replayed conversations, searched for hidden meanings, and wondered whether their distance meant they never cared. You may have convinced yourself that if you could just become more patient, more understanding, more reassuring, or less demanding, they would finally feel safe enough to stay. But love was never supposed to require you to constantly shrink yourself so another person could tolerate closeness. You were never responsible for managing someone else's fear of intimacy. You could offer safety, compassion, honesty, and patience, but you could never do their emotional work for them. At some point, loving them had to stop meaning waiting for them and start meaning choosing what was healthy for you. The truth is, an avoidant person's realization does not happen because you find the perfect words. It does not happen because you explain your feelings one more time. It does not happen because you prove that you are different from everyone who hurt them before. Sometimes the greatest shift happens when you stop participating in the cycle altogether. When you stop chasing someone who keeps retreating, you are not punishing them. You are simply refusing to abandon yourself in order to maintain a connection. That distinction matters. There is a difference between giving someone space and putting your entire life on hold for them. There is a difference between understanding someone's wounds and allowing those wounds to repeatedly wound you. You can have compassion for why someone behaves the way they do without accepting behavior that continuously leaves you emotionally exhausted. And if they eventually turn around and realize that your presence is gone, let that realization belong to them. Maybe they will miss your voice, your patience, your warmth, the way you understood things they never knew how to explain. Maybe they will remember the moments when you tried to reach them while they were busy convincing themselves they did not need anyone. Maybe they will finally recognize that what they called pressure was sometimes simply emotional intimacy, and what they called freedom was sometimes just distance. But you do not need to stand there waiting for that recognition. You do not need to remain emotionally available so they can eventually understand your value. Your worth was never determined by whether they were emotionally capable of recognizing it at the time. Someone's inability to receive love does not make the love less real. There is also something important to understand about the silence that comes after you finally stop chasing. At first, that silence may feel uncomfortable for you too. You may wonder whether you made the right decision. You may feel tempted to send another message, check whether they have returned, or create some small excuse to reopen communication. But healing often begins in the exact space where you once felt desperate to receive an answer. You begin discovering that silence does not always mean rejection. Sometimes silence is where your nervous system finally gets a chance to breathe. It is where you stop interpreting every little action and start listening to yourself again. You begin remembering who you were before the relationship became a constant question mark. And slowly, the person who once waited for someone else to choose them becomes the person who chooses themselves without needing permission. That is the transformation the avoidant may never have expected. They may have assumed that you would always be there, always understand, always forgive, and always leave the door open. But eventually, you realize that keeping a door open for someone who repeatedly refuses to walk through it can keep you trapped in the same emotional room. Closing that door does not mean you hate them. It does not erase what happened. It does not mean the love was fake. It simply means that your life cannot remain suspended around another person's uncertainty. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop trying to rescue a relationship that requires two emotionally present people. You can wish them healing without becoming responsible for providing it. You can care about them without continuing to sacrifice your peace for their comfort. And this is where the deeper lesson of avoidant attachment becomes important. People often assume the avoidant is simply afraid of losing their independence. But sometimes what they are truly afraid of is what happens when another person becomes important enough to affect them. Because once you care deeply, you become vulnerable to disappointment, rejection, grief, and loss. The avoidant may try to prevent those feelings by keeping relationships at a distance. But avoiding vulnerability also means avoiding the deepest forms of connection. You cannot protect yourself from heartbreak without also limiting your ability to experience intimacy. You cannot build a completely controlled emotional life and expect it to feel fully alive. Eventually, everyone has to decide whether they want perfect protection or genuine connection. You cannot always have both. And maybe one day they will understand that the person they were running from was never actually their enemy. You were not trying to take their freedom. You were asking them to be emotionally present. You were not demanding perfection. You were asking for honesty. You were not asking them to surrender themselves. You were asking them to let you know the real person behind the walls. That may be something they could not tolerate then, but perhaps life will eventually teach them what you could not. Sometimes people understand the value of emotional safety only after they experience its absence. Sometimes they recognize the difference between someone who wanted to control them and someone who simply wanted to connect with them. And sometimes that realization arrives long after the person who loved them has already moved forward. So if you are currently wondering whether they miss you, whether they regret leaving, whether they think about you, or whether they will ever understand what they lost, bring your attention back to something more important. Do not build your healing around their future realization. Do not make your peace dependent on a message that may never come. Do not measure your importance by how dramatically someone reacts to your absence. You mattered before they understood it. You mattered while they were confused. You mattered even when they were pulling away. Their emotional limitations were never a measurement of your value. You do not need someone who struggles to receive love to give you permission to believe that you are worthy of being loved consistently. And if they do come back someday, remember that returning is not automatically the same as changing. Missing you is not the same as becoming emotionally available. Regret is not the same as accountability. Words are not the same as consistent behavior. If they genuinely want another chance, the question should not simply be whether they still have feelings. The deeper question is whether they have developed the emotional capacity to build something healthier than what existed before. Can they communicate when they are uncomfortable? Can they remain present instead of disappearing? Can they acknowledge their part without becoming defensive? Can they tolerate intimacy without immediately creating distance? Can they respect your boundaries instead of testing them? Those are the things that matter, because love without emotional responsibility can continue repeating the same painful cycle, no matter how intense the feelings are. And for you, the greatest victory is not making an avoidant chase you. It is becoming so grounded in yourself that you no longer need someone to chase you in order to feel valuable. You no longer need their jealousy, regret, return, apology, or emotional breakdown to prove that you mattered. You know what you gave. You know how deeply you cared. You know how many times you tried to understand, communicate, forgive, and hold space for someone who was struggling to hold space for themselves. That knowledge can become enough. You can leave the door closed without hatred. You can remember the beautiful moments without romanticizing the painful ones. You can acknowledge that someone may have loved you and still been incapable of loving you in the way you needed. Both things can be true at the same time, because sometimes the most painful relationships teach you the clearest lessons about what love should actually feel like. Love should not constantly leave you guessing where you stand. It should not require you to decode silence. It should not make you feel as though asking for basic emotional presence is asking for too much. Healthy love can have fear, conflict, uncertainty, and imperfect moments, but it also contains communication, accountability, effort, and the willingness to repair. You deserve a connection where you do not have to become smaller to keep someone comfortable. You deserve someone who does not treat your emotional needs as an invasion. You deserve a relationship where closeness is not something you have to repeatedly negotiate. So let them have their journey. Let them confront whatever they need to confront. Let them discover the consequences of the patterns they once believed were protecting them. Maybe they will grow. Maybe they will finally become honest with themselves. Maybe they will understand the depth of what they lost. But you do not have to stand still and wait for that chapter to be written. Your chapter is already moving forward. The moment you stopped chasing, something powerful happened. You stopped asking another person to validate what you already knew inside. You began reclaiming your attention, your energy, your dignity, and your peace. And that is not a small thing. That is growth. Remember this. You were never meant to spend your life convincing someone to see your value. You were meant to experience love with someone who can recognize it while they are receiving it. Someone who can stay when things become emotionally real. Someone who can communicate instead of disappearing. Someone who understands that vulnerability is not a threat, but an invitation to deeper connection. And if an avoidant person eventually reaches that understanding, that is their growth. If they never do, that is not your failure. You cannot heal another person's attachment wounds by loving them harder. You can only decide what kind of love you are willing to accept.